Well, he was born as named George Calvin Cochran. It's very common in the South to use family names as middle names. He was always called Calvin, but unfortunately that frequently got changed to Calvin, which he detested, so he insisted on being called George. Growing up, he was Calvin.
He would share jokes about problems in his family, but the extraordinary contributions that the Cochran and the Colvin family made to Kentucky history was nothing that he ever bragged about or talked about.
They were the hoi polloi. We were white privilege, no doubt about it. We were the country club set. Both of his parents were heavy drinkers, and those were the years he called the snake pit years. One quote I heard was, "Your father was the best lawyer around, sober or drunk." So
he wasn't always close with his family. He felt that he was sent away to a boarding school when he didn't necessarily want to go there. He talked about alcoholism in his family.
He survived. Libby was a very fair-skinned black woman that her neighbors called Red. I believe she was probably hired about the time they moved to the house on Jersey Ridge. That would have been George was probably about 2 years old when they moved to this house. I think she was the reason George survived. Gave him the love that he didn't necessarily get elsewhere. She was his rock. George had a degree from North Carolina State where he was active in student politics. That's probably when he first got involved. He found he had a good voice.
He ended up doing some interesting stuff. George went to college and he played, he was a quarterback. He played football, he played baseball, and he carried on a passion about sports throughout his life. I would guess that would surprise a lot of people. He was in the military, he was a paratrooper for a while. He didn't like to talk about that very much. So his family is in textile in Maysville, Kentucky.
I'm imagining that George's future was sort of planned for him as far as the cotton mill.
When he was working for his family at the textile mill right after undergraduate school and wound up getting fired, a part of that was because he had made friends with some of the front line labor there and kind of thought it was rotten that all they got at Christmas was a turkey and that sort of thing. And so I think they considered him a bit of a rabble-rouser, and that might be how he got fired.
I remember him telling me that he went to law school terrified, and it kept him working very, very hard.
He had really turned his life around in law school and become an intellectual powerhouse and superstar student. So he reached out and made connections with Justice Stanley Reed, who was a retired Supreme Court Justice in DC, and went and met with him. And they hit it off. So Justice Reed invited George to come and become part of his chambers and to work as a clerk for him. And the relationship that they formed was one that was powerful.
I used to talk about Justice Warren in class, and I would say the same Justice Warren that gave us George Cochran and resolved the Kennedy assassination once and for all.
You know, he worked on the Warren Commission report. He was intimately involved in that. I think in some ways that Justice Warren was more of an intellectual model for him, and Justice Reed was more of a personal model. And that's reflected in the fact that he named his daughter, the most important person in his life, Reed, after Justice Reed.
So my father was in law school at Chapel Hill, and my mother was getting her undergraduate degree from Duke. And they met there and fell in love. And both of them had been married before. My father was determined that he would not get married and not have children. And my mother really wanted to marry him. And he refused. So she moved to New York and enrolled in graduate school. You know, the relationship was supposedly over, but when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, that was a big cathartic event for the country, as everybody knows, and it was for him as well. And he went to New York and got my mother, and they got married shortly thereafter. Like lots of us, he wanted very much to have a great love story, and he got one with my mother, and that's how I ultimately made it to the planet.
I know exactly what caused his move to the University of Mississippi because I asked him. He had a good job. He had some very interesting work at Duke, and he came to the University of Mississippi because there was an opening here, and he had been reading for several years about the sort of constitutional crisis that was developing in the state, and that the University of Mississippi Law School was at the center of. Civil rights was the burning issue of the day. Even as a law student, he had worked on a special symposium issue as editor-in-chief of the Law Journal, which had brought in people like Robert Kennedy speaking on issues of civil rights. So he was already deeply immersed in the cutting-edge, big issue of the day. And then, of course, he went into practice, and he had some experience in practice as a civil rights litigator. And he had gone to Duke and had sort of organized their externship placement of students in positions of need around the state. Each one of those activities in his life before he came here made him ever more aware of the critical importance of civil rights and constitutional law as a force of control in the social system.
George was in for his interview. He'd been selected from the group of applicants to bring to school to see about hiring him. We needed a constitutional law teacher, and he was well prepared to do that. He comes into my office and just walks in, sits down, puts his feet up on my desk. I'd never seen him before, and he said something like, "Well, Bob, what the heck's going on here?" And he lit a cigarette, and I said, "What do you have in mind? What are y'all doing?" I said, "Well, we're trying to teach law, George."
George was always concerned about the old boy network and this law school and running this law school and hiring internally and not getting outside influence and being driven by politicians in Jackson. That was always a concern.
When I came there, George was sort of a person pushing the law school to move into the modern era.
Well, there would be many individual decisions made over the years. He stood firmly on the side of looking at what the national developing standards were, hiring people without respect to what their politics were, without respect to what their political connections were, and certainly not giving any privilege to white Mississippians that were considered safe on the issue of race. If anything, he saw it as extremely important to bring in outside voices that were part of the mainstream discussion, even though those were critical of the state's traditional legal positions, and had the potential to make people feel uncomfortable from time to time.
I was sitting at my desk in the old law school building on my very first day of work, and then all of a sudden this cat came through the door with his shirt untucked, unbuttoned, bottom and top, unidentified stains on his shirt, hair all over the place, and he walked in and he said, "Hey there, shithead, nice to meet you."
No, I won't call him eccentric, but he was not in the usual mold.
I lived with him. He was my roommate. He dressed sloppily. His shirt was always out. There was frequently something on his tie from breakfast or maybe breakfast 2 weeks ago. He talked really quickly, and he would just wander off.
George's style fit George. He was not a guy using anyone else's style or copying anyone else. George was a funny guy to hang around with because he would say what was on his mind, and he had, one of the very best, if not the best mind I've ever encountered. I mean, I've met lots and lots of smart people, but George Cochran was just amazing.
I don't know if every law school is like this, but he was the one at our law school. There were stories passed on, and I still don't know if some of them are true about, that he burned a flag to prove the point about, that it's constitutional and First Amendment free speech to burn a flag, and that a Marine came running down from the back of class one time to stop him from doing it.
We sat down, he showed us the casebook that we had. I think it was like 1,600 pages. And he slams it on the desk. He goes, "You're responsible for all of this."
And there was this younger student, I don't know what her name was, I can't remember, but picked on her for something, and she was kind of unprepared, and he just started, you know, whatever. Well, tell me about this. And finally she started crying, and he said, "Miss So-and-so, when a Fifth Circuit judge leans over, looks over the top of his glasses at you and says, 'What book of legal fiction did you grab that idea from?' and you know your name's not John Grisham, you're going to appreciate me."
And he would look at someone and say, "Grigsby, you're on, run it." And you would need to run the constitutional analysis that a judge might undertake to go through the facts. It wasn't in your reading the night before. You were supposed to think.
Yeah, he was tough, but he made you think, and he made you be prepared, because you couldn't, if you go to court and you're not prepared, you're in trouble. I think he had everybody grow up.
George could insult the classroom, he could insult individuals in a way that just made you draw closer to him. I can't explain it any better than that.
We stayed in contact. We worked on cases for a decade or so. Then we bought a sailboat together. Take off for a week or two, and we'd go get the boat and we sail it south, Florida. And then we went to Key West, and then we went to Cuba. And we both had a daughter. My daughter was named Niani, and there was Reed. And every summer, George and I would do a daddy's daughters trip. And we'd take our daughters and we'd go on some adventure someplace.
You know, Reed hung the moon for George.
George didn't like to brag about himself, but he was not stinting in his pride and his bragging about Reed.
Reed was George's central concern, the central reason for his life. He absolutely adored her.
Well, in terms of his overall legacy, I would probably sum it up in one word, and that would be Reed. You know, Reed Cochran. That's his biggest lasting legacy to the planet Earth.
Yeah, you know, if there was one guiding principle that I observed in George, he never put it in words. In fact, he would have kicked me out of the office and called me a redneck if I tried to. But his guiding principle was he stood up for people without power. It's that simple.
He definitely believed that every day you get up and you do something to help other people.
Originally, the Innocence Project worked primarily with DNA and trying to use DNA to prove that people who are incarcerated, you know, were in fact not guilty. And George decided we needed to have one here in Mississippi, and ideally at the university.
He was the one who went around to his colleagues, former students, members of the bar, and really raised the initial money to get the Innocence Project in Mississippi started. So there would be no Innocence Project in Mississippi. There would probably be some people who were executed as a result of there not being the Innocence Project if it were not for George Cochran.
In essence, George had been saying, you know, I told you that these people who are condemned, they have a story to tell, and we ought to listen to that story.
His impact on the institution is deep and profound. If you look at the composition of the law school, who's on the law school faculty, the kinds of people that are on the law school faculty, if you look at the racial diversity of the law school, student body, faculty, if you look at the good relationship of faculty and staff at the law school, if you look at the size of the library, the number of volumes we have, if you look at the quality of the programming, the good things about the law school owe a lot to George Cochran.
The impact he had on so many of our students would be his greatest legacy. He was a good teacher, and that's the truth.
I mean, George was a wonderful friend. He just had a way about him.
In my loneliest time in my life, George Cochran, of all people, was the one who wasn't afraid to come console me, to sympathize with me, and then to give me the pep talk that said, "What are you going to go do now?"
George was a good man.
You know, he was just the kind of friend you could tell things to. You'd come out helped and feeling better. And I miss that a lot.
I thought he was a very special person. He was my hero.
He was brilliant, he was fun, and he made a difference.